Hello, and welcome to the Voice of the Washington Monthly, your source for policy, politics, and fresh ideas. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, the right to citizenship if you're born on U.S. soil, and a threat from Donald Trump to end that.
My new term in office, I will sign an executive order making clear to federal agencies that the future children of illegal aliens will not receive automatic U.S. citizenship.
President-elect Donald Trump made this promise during his campaign, and in a recent appearance on Meet the Press, he doubled down on his pledge to end automatic citizenship for people born in America. Can he really do that? Today, we'll cover the basics of birthright citizenship and why it's more fragile than you might think. We'll also debunk the myths of anchor babies, the excuses conservatives are using to justify the destruction of more than a century of settled law. Stay with us right here at the Washington Monthly. Hey, Garrett, great to see you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, it's just you and me today, but I do want to remind our listeners that you are also the Washington Monthly's legal affairs editor. You are also a professor of constitutional law at the University of Oregon, and you are an expert on citizenship, which is what we are talking about today. Well, so the first question I have for you, we take for granted that people born on U.S. soil are U.S. citizens, but I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that this right is not, in fact, something that's explicitly guaranteed by the Constitution. So can you explain the historical legal basis for birthright citizenship?
I think it's almost as close as the Constitution gets to being explicit, right? Constitution is a 7,000 word document, and so it jams a lot of ideas into a small space. But what the 14th Amendment says, and it's important that this is the 14th Amendment, is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. There's a lot in that. But the phrase that, and, honestly, since 1898, it has been taken for granted, just as a matter of black letter law, that if you are born in the United States, with the exception of one small group, and that is the children of diplomats, then you are an American citizen.
If you could back up a little bit to 1898, you mentioned that year. What happened in 1898?
1898 is really important because at that time, an American-born man named Wong Kim Ark, born in San Francisco to two immigrant parents, was on his way back from China. He had gone to visit family in China, and the government refused to let him in. They said, "You're not a U.S. citizen." His position was, "I am born in the United States." He had all the records to prove that. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which voted 6-2 to affirm Wong Kim Ark's citizenship and said that, with the exception of these few narrow categories, anyone born in the U.S., regardless of how they got there. And this is important because remember, Wong's parents could not become citizens because of the racist Chinese exclusion law.
Right.
And that was the government's position was, well, look, his parents can't be citizens. Why can he? And the court said, that doesn't signify. The amendment is very clear. Is he subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Yes. What that means is, can he be arrested? Can he be sued? Is he subject to the obligations of citizenship when he's here? And the answer is yes. That has been black letter law for more than a century. And it's really only around 2000 that we began to hear this noise coming out of some far right think tanks to the effect that that there's a secret Da Vinci Code meaning to these words. Now, this is a gift to us, another gift to the nation from our friend John C. Eastman of the Claremont Institute. He has been laboring this position for 25 years, and it has gradually begun to be discussed. I wouldn't say in the mainstream, but in mainstream right-wing circles, to the point that we are now very concerned that this administration may make some moves that will try to compromise this very important constitutional value.
Now, Eastman's argument is based upon those words, subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
Yes.
And if I remember right, there's also a dissent in the Wong Kim Ark decision that turned on those words as well.
Right. Yep.
What exactly is Eastman's argument, and does it hold any water at all?
Eastman's argument is that the word subject to the jurisdiction do not mean their common sense meaning. If I said to you, are you subject to the jurisdiction of the state of Virginia when you go driving there? I think your answer is going to be yes. But he says subject to the jurisdiction actually means that you have no relation to any foreign country. Obviously, children born in the United States to parents who are from other countries who are not citizens can be said to have a relationship to that country. It's pretty strained even at that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I call Da Vinci Code constitutionalism, because the words are right there. And any first-year law student knows what subject to the jurisdiction means. But we get a sort of, I don't know if you ever saw Chicago, but Billy Flynn comes out and says, give him the old razzle-dazzle, razzle-dazzle him, give him an act with lots of flash in it. And that's what we begin to get. It's, oh, no, it doesn't mean that. It means something else. And the people who wrote the amendment and said it didn't were confused. It's a very strained argument that is being made. And it has now become at least stated policy of the incoming administration.
Now, this legal argument isn't the only argument that the far right is making against birthright citizenship.
Mm.
Trump has articulated some of these arguments. Here's a little clip from his campaign ad.
The United States is among the only countries in the world that says that even if neither parent is a citizen nor even lawfully in the country, their future children are automatic citizens the moment the parents trespass onto our soil. As has been laid out by many scholars, this current policy is based on a historical myth and a willful misinterpretation of the law by the open borders advocates.
So in this clip, he's arguing that America is unique, maybe out of step with the rest of the world in having birthright citizenship. Is he right about that?
Well, no, first of all, there's a significant number of countries in this hemisphere who have birthright citizenship. And in a funny way, it may be that civilizations that have been powered by immigration have a more important relationship to incoming people and their being born. But it simply isn't true that we're the only country in the world. And isn't there some irony in hearing Trump say, we're not like the rest of the world, America's exception. We don't want to be an American exception. Birthright citizenship for years was a point of pride in this country because it did embody that American exceptionalism, that idea that we are the nation that welcomes people from all over the world, and that this is a good thing about America, that we don't want to be like Russia or Turkey or someplace that is restricted, or Germany that is restrictive of citizenship.
Nevertheless, he has made this a cornerstone of his campaign and now his presidency. And in the introduction to this episode, we played a clip of Trump promising on day one of his presidency to end birthright citizenship by executive order. So if we can talk a little bit about, can he really do that? Like, how do you expect this effort to play out in real life?
Well, my assumption is that we are going to begin to see a lot of actions nibbling at the edge. A lot of, in other words, I don't think we're going to have a no citizenship day and with parade and balloons, but we're going to see directives maybe to the State Department to begin denying passport renewals to people who can't prove that their parents were citizens. We've had some of this. This is happening at the state level in as many as 8 states in the past 10 years, is that the state governments have begun to refuse to register immigrant children if they don't have American ID. So you have proof of birth and you have proof of place of birth, but it's issued by the consulate, for example, because the parents, are citizens of Mexico or the Dominican Republic. And the state will simply say, no, we won't register your child as born in the United States. So we're going to see more hand throwing. That'll happen at the could happen at the national level. And, obviously it will end up in court. I would like to say that it's a very open and shut question, but this is 2024. There are no certainties in constitutional law anymore. They're just 9 mysterious people.
How worried are you that this court is going to revisit Wong Kim Ark?
Well, I think the odds are that they won't get there because they have to get through a lot of things to get there. The first is, does the president have the power to terminate birthright citizenship?
Hmm.
I think the answer to that is pretty clearly no. The 14th Amendment says Congress shall have power to enforce the provisions of this amendment. And the Constitution itself, the original Constitution, says Congress has the power to enact a uniform rule of naturalization. Now, we have statutes on the books passed by Congress that say people born in the U.S. are natural born citizens, and that's the end of it. So you'd have to first take the position that that statute is unconstitutional. It's very hard for me to see how you make that case. Then you have to get to the point of the executive having the power. Then you have to get to the 14th Amendment issue. So I would like to say it won't happen, but I covered the court long enough to know, remember when people were saying, oh, don't worry, they're not going to hold Obamacare. They're going to affirm Obamacare 9-0. There's nothing
Right.
really solid anymore. And we have heard news. I mean, we have heard murmurs, from inside the judiciary of sympathy for this position. So, we just don't know what's floating around inside the world of the conservative justices.
Wow. Now, you mentioned Congress, though, and there is legislation that Lindsey Graham has
Yeah.
introduced to basically do the same thing as what
Mhm.
Trump has promised to do by executive order. Does the fact that legislation is winding its way through and that too could be challenged, does that change the calculus in any way?
Well, it would certainly be a stronger case if Congress passes a statute. I think, you and I can sort of ask ourselves how likely we think that is in the next 2 years. When you look at the margins in the House, we only need, 4 or 5 Republicans to say, look, there are people in my district who are really upset about this. I'm not voting to do it. But if Congress did approve it, you then have the question of whether they're overriding the text of the Constitution. And there's been a pretty general agreement for more than a century that the text of the Constitution means what it says, subject to the jurisdiction, not a secret code, not Captain Midnight decoder ring. It means subject to the jurisdiction. So, I do think, and that there is the chance for a lot of mischief to be made and a lot of children to be hurt, and a lot, if in fact we see mass deportations going on in this country, then a lot of children who are American born citizens will probably be scooped up in that mass process and sent back to their countries of origin. That happened in the 50s with Operation Wetback. Many, many, many U.S. citizens were deported without any due process or anything else. So, the prospect is for maybe long-term vindication, but almost certainly short-term pain.
Yeah. I do think that we're going to have to fighting in the court of public opinion, as well as
Yes.
in the courts themselves over this issue. So I do want to spend a couple moments here kind of debunking the myths, the alleged policy arguments the conservatives are also using to
Yeah.
justify this push to end birthright citizenship.
Mm.
And I think probably number one of the most pernicious myths around the urgency to end birthright from the conservative point of view is the myth of the anchor baby.
Mm-hmm.
Once upon a time, this term anchor baby was offensive enough that Jeb Bush's presidential campaign was derailed. That was only in 2015. So things have really changed since then. Just, the basic claim here is that undocumented immigrants arrive and have children as soon as possible under this misguided belief that having citizen children will somehow protect them from deportation. And of course, that's not true. I looked this figure up. The American Immigration Council says there are about 4.4 million U.S. children who have undocumented parents. But having a U.S. child does not actually protect you from deportation. And the second thing is, it isn't easy for a citizen child to sponsor their parents for a green card. First of all, you have to be 21, according to current law. And then you also have to show that you can financially support your parents so they don't become wards of the state. After that, it takes another 5 years to get citizenship once you have that green card. So we're talking about a minimum 26-year path to citizenship if you arrive here undocumented and decide to have a child.
That's right. And I think that this term anchor baby, I don't know who thought it up. It's a kind of evil genius of propaganda. It turns, babies, American children, our neighbors into objects made out of lead. And you mentioned that there was a period not that long ago where this kind of talk was not okay. And now to talk about pregnant women, to talk about mothers that way, as if they were livestock, is shocking and improper. And it describes a circumstance that simply doesn't exist. The dialogue about immigration has been coarsened to such a degree that it's almost impossible to have a sane conversation. The vocabulary is just so polluted.
And it's been kind of Trump's strategy all along to use
Right.
dehumanizing language and to depict immigrants as not people. In fact, I think he may have actually used those words to describe people who
He
come to
said,
this
these
country.
are not people, these are animals. And if you go back and look at Trump's political career, it has been powered by questions of citizenship. He rose to prominence saying that Obama was not a natural born citizen.
Right.
During the primary in 2015, 2016, he repeatedly referred to Ted Cruz as the anchor baby because Cruz was the child of a Cuban father and American citizen mother. He was born in Canada, but under the law, he is a natural born citizen. He said the same thing about Marco Rubio, who was born in Florida to legal immigrant children. Before Rubio withdrew, there was a plan to bring a lawsuit to keep him off the ballot by the Trump campaign. Come forward to 2020. And our friend John Eastman pops up writing an op-ed saying that Kamala Harris is not a natural born citizen, maybe not a U.S. citizen at all. And, I think that it's not entirely a coincidence that the targets of this are people of color, and that there's an attempt being made to racialize citizenship, which we have not had in this country for many years, thank God. And I think that ought to hook us in a little bit to our history and to why we have this rule. Because at the end of the Civil War, the South and the Supreme Court had taken the position that the persons of African descent in the United States weren't citizens and could never be citizens.
Right.
Could never be citizens, even if Congress passed a law. And this this was a major cause of the Civil War. This had to be reversed. And the framers of the 14th Amendment wrote the amendment in sweeping terms to try to make it clear that if you are born here, we're not going to argue anymore about your citizenship. We're all in this together. We are a multicultural, multiracial democracy. And, we're not going to have white people, closing the Palisades and saying, the rest of you don't belong here. And the attempt to revitalize this issue, the attempt to bring about the legal disqualification of, 11, 12 million people, maybe. If you've studied the history of the Civil War, if you studied the framing of the 14th Amendment, as I have, it's like an attempt to reinvent the Confederacy. People want to have a shadow population in the United States that has no rights. Now, we saw how that ended up in 1861. But not just that. I think if you study the history of 20th century dictatorships, those dictators, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, they all began to nibble away at the edges of citizenship. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union reserved the power to revoke anyone's citizenship for anti-state activities. Hitler, as we know, stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship, and that was the first step on the path to the Holocaust. I don't want politicians' hands on citizenship.
Right. And I also want to point out here that the insistence, I guess, on citizenship through blood, which is what the birthright citizenship opponents are saying, really harkens back to, white supremacy and, white nationalism.
Absolutely.
And it is very Hitler-esque in the way that it's being framed through blood versus through the soil.
Yes. Well, and remember, Trump has got a real obsession with citizenship. I remember that in the week he was inaugurated, he was not even sworn in as president at this point. He floated a proposal that anyone who burned an American flag would lose their citizenship. He wants to get his hands on citizenship and define who is his equal and define who can vote. define who counts. And that's a very dangerous power to give anyone, particularly somebody who seems to be a couple of tacos short of the full fiesta platter.
Yes, he's building a very exclusive club, and I think we can all guess
Yes.
who would be in that club.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've actually talked a lot about kind of the moral and cultural implications of ending
Yeah.
birthright citizenship. But I think there will be temptation on the part of a lot of people to say that it doesn't matter for them. There are no practical consequences for your average ordinary American. And I'm actually not sure that's true. I mean, just practical concerns about bureaucracy and paperwork. Pretty much anyone who has a child maybe would need to take their passport or citizenship papers to the hospital to prove their child is a citizen when they're born. I mean, it does affect all of us, right?
I think that's right. And I think that, we have, in this country, we have tried as best we can not to move toward a show me your papers society. And there's no question that I have a passport, but let's suppose I go to renew my passport and the passport bureau says, well, we've decided you're not really a citizen. Now, that has happened in this country. It's happened in the last 4 years to people who could not get their passports renewed. How do I prove? I mean, I guess I could go down to Richmond and try to find a birth certificate, but that doesn't record the citizenship of my parents.
Right.
How do I prove my parents are long gone to their reward? How do I prove it? And am I now in a kind of shadow area? And I don't think we should kid ourselves. This shadow population is going to be very much racialized. It's going to be vulnerable groups and the people who are already being targeted by a lot of people on the right for all kinds of harassment and disability.
Right. Right. And that's going to have huge implications on access to services, access to education, access to healthcare. People who are citizens are not going to have access to these services because of the fear as well as the bureaucracy involved in being able to get the services and the rights that they're entitled to.
Yes,
So yeah,
and on top of that, we have case law, relatively recent in historic terms, that says that states can't exclude the children of undocumented aliens. They can't exclude undocumented immigrants themselves from benefits, most particularly including public education. And you can imagine the effect on our society if we had thousands and thousands of children who couldn't go to school. And one thing to focus on and be sobered by is that really from the day he arrived in Washington, a young lawyer named John Roberts was campaigning against that rule and made it very clear in memoranda that are available in the National Archives that he thought Plyler versus Doe, the case I'm talking about, had been wrongly decided and needed to be reversed. So pardon me if I'm nervous, but there you go.
wow. Well, on that very sobering note, it has been good to talk to you, Garrett, about this, and we'll all be waiting to see what happens on January 21st.
Well, between the two of us, Ann, we're going to be all over this story. So people should make sure to follow this podcast.
All right, take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.